the gallery route? Have you diverged into other areas?
Yeah, it's a mixture now. So that first year that I was going full time, I had said to myself something really important that I still keep to today, which is I wrote down 3 things that I wanted to spend my time doing. And those things were creating art and writing and teaching. And I knew, I mean, since childhood that's always been my passion, those 3 things. So I decided that I would only take jobs or create jobs for myself that allowed me to do those things and nothing else, because I didn't want to fall into the trap of like accepting a wedding shoot or an engagement shoot or headshots or something like that would turn photography into a job that I didn't enjoy, because I don't like photography very much as a medium, to be honest. Like, I wouldn't choose to be a photographer in the commercial sense of it. So I didn't want to ruin it for myself. So I decided I would take odd jobs if I had to. But in that first year, I self-published a book because I couldn't find a publisher. I started paying for my gallery shows because nobody would accept me. And I started putting out online that I was going to teach workshops, whether I was qualified or not to do that. So those are the things that I started doing, and that's sort of what I've continued to grow ever since then, because it's what I've always loved, but hopefully I'm doing it slightly more successfully now. So I'm showing in galleries and giving motivational lectures and writing books as well.
During those times when you decided just to go with it full on, it had to have been scary in some kind of way to suddenly put everything in this, I would say, not all your eggs in one basket, but to start doing this more full time. How do you approach fear and times when you're not necessarily sure of what you're doing?
Well, I tend to think that I am a bit of a spontaneous person and a little bit of a risk taker, or maybe a lot even, but I also have this very grounded side of myself where I'm extremely practical and extremely responsible in my real life, you know? So I tend to sort of weigh the risk and say, am I going to be hurting somebody else in my life if I do this? I don't really care so much about if I hurt myself as much, but, you know, I'm married and like I want to be able to, you know, help my family out if they need something. So I always say, do I have enough money saved up if this goes really horribly wrong? And is the risk only emotional? Because if the risk is something where like for example, I quit my job, I went full time into photography, and I had enough money saved for at least a few months where I could continue living without making any money for a few months. And I said to myself, okay, I know that I can get some job if I need to. I know that if things are going really horribly, there isn't that much risk in this because I'll know ahead of time that I'm not making money and I have money saved and I can get a job. So in that case, the risk was just, am I going to feel like a failure? Am I going to look stupid if I do this? All those things that we struggle with when we're making a big decision. And so if those are my main fears, then I'm definitely going to do it because I would rather look stupid in front of the whole world than never try something. So that's kind of my scale for if I'm going to do something big like that.
I also noticed on your website that there's a large charity component to what you do. What made you first get involved in charity and charities, and how do you work with charities now?
When I first got started, it was all because of this beautiful woman named Laura Price, and she runs an organization called Blossomy, where she brings creative individuals over to Calcutta, India, to teach creative workshops to shelter homes and survivors of human trafficking. So that's what she does, and she contacted me out of the blue and just said, I saw your photography and I don't know if you've ever considered doing something like this, but it seems like you would be a good fit for the work that I'm trying to do in India. So I wrote back and I said, that's great timing because I'm also really wanting to get into some sort of charity work. But as so many people know, it's so hard to know where to start with something like that. And you start to question, am I actually making a difference, or is this really the best use of my resources? So it was a good trip. I went to India a few months later and taught my first workshop there. and I loved it. And I was teaching self-portraiture and self-expression through art. So that's what I did the first time. And then I started thinking after I went back a second time, this is great that I'm able to do this, but what impact am I really having on the people here if I'm there for 2 weeks and then I go home every year and that's it? So the work that I do now has evolved into not just teaching these workshops, which I still do 5 years down the line, but I've also started a photo school in India and soon to be Thailand as well. That's still working with the same community, underprivileged communities, and specifically survivors of the sex trade. But this is a very practical photo education school called the Light Space that provides practical real world training to young women there so that they can make a living with their photography and hopefully move out of the shelter home system and be on their own, independent.
Well, that's wonderful. If listeners would like to hear or see more about that, is there a website that you have for them or?
It's called thelightspace.org.
Okay. And when did you start that?
That was, we officially opened our doors in November 2015. So we've had one graduating class and we'll hopefully be starting the next class soon.
Okay, that's wonderful. With the other side of what you do, the public speaking and the writing, what are some topics that you cover?
I do a lot of lecturing about how to be the main character in your life. So not just creating art, not just living for other people, but how can you sort of see yourself as the main character in your life where you're creating an active story around yourself so that you're living a more fulfilled and passionate life. So that's one of the topics that I'm extremely inspired to talk to people about, because the number one problem that I see in so many people is that they have lost their true sense of self and their true why in life. And if you don't know what your why is, then I can't imagine being able to find meaning in many of the things that you do and the experiences that you're having. So that's one thing that I love to speak to people about. And then I love writing about the same topics as well as inspiration and sometimes technical things to do with photography and a whole range of topics.
Why do you think that people have lost the why in their life?
I think because we've been trained not to even ask, largely. I mean, there's this sort of herd mentality that you grow up with in a lot of different societies where, you go to maybe public school and you're taught to blend in and try to, not make ripples and make friends with everybody and not cause conflict. And not do anything that's out of the ordinary because people will make fun of you or people will look at you funny, and you become afraid to ask yourself what your purpose is. And I think that it's also a little bit risky too. Like, people see that decision to go after what you are truly called to do. It's seen as risky because it's entrepreneurial and it's not safe and there is no desk job for that. So I think that people lose even the question, like they don't even know to ask anymore. And I think that it's so sad because what if we all knew our why? Think of the amazing things we could do with the world if we all sort of jumped to our calling.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast yesterday. It was an interview with Peter Diamandis, and he said something very, very similar to what you're talking about. He's focused more on the technology side and the, moonshots and getting people on Mars. But everything that he talked about came down to, this is my purpose in life and this is why I'm doing this. And he boiled it down to 3 different things, which I thought was absolutely amazing, that somebody as busy and was running, I don't know how many companies he runs, and was doing such amazing things, was I focus everything I do down to these 3 important things in my life, and everything comes from that.
Yeah. It's amazing.
What ideas or tips or strategies would you give to somebody who was just saying, okay, so I want to find the why in my life. Where do I start?
Well, where I started was in two places. One was to say, in what way am I different from other people? Like, what really, when I tell people this thing about myself, makes them look at me really funny? And for me, that was this desire to create dark art. It was this desire to share this really strange part of my brain that didn't seem to fit the outside of who I was. So I knew that I wanted to share something in that vein that would maybe make people uncomfortable, but also make them confront something within themselves. Because I've always found beauty in darkness, and that has always been something that people have found to be very strange. But the other thing was just, like I talked about when I decided to become a full-time photographer, was asking myself, what do I want to spend my days doing? Because ultimately, our lives come down to what we choose to do with our time. And so much of our time is eaten up by things that we don't want to be doing. So if I had to ask myself, what are the top 3 things that I want to spend my time doing? And then how can I link that to my purpose? Then suddenly you've built a business for yourself.
Mm-hmm. So with that business, and actually this might come into play with your personal business, are there books you recommend that people look into, or online courses that help them take that why and take that idea and then practically extrapolate it out?
Yeah, I think that, so there are a couple of books. One is much more on the inspirational side of things, but I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Gilbert. So her book, Big Magic, is amazing and so motivational. There's another book called The Icarus Effect, I think by Seth Godin, but I might be wrong about that, but I think so. And that book is incredible because it's all about, it's a metaphor basically talking about the story of Icarus, and how we're told about that story is that Icarus flew too close to the sun and his wings melted, and so he fell into the water. But the other part of the story that we're not told is this idea that he was also told not to fly too close to the water because he would also then perish. But we don't get told that part of the story because it doesn't fit into our current social narrative. Instead, we're just told don't aim too high instead of being told don't aim too low. So that's what that book is about. And I think that it's just a beautifully written book.
Wow, I'm going to have to look into that. I had not, honestly, I wasn't familiar with that other side of Icarus.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Surprising. Yeah. If there was somebody listening who was just starting out as a photographer and wanted to start their own business, what advice would you give them?
I think first and foremost is to understand your message. And I get a lot of pushback on this sometimes because every once in a while I'll talk to somebody who's like, you know what, I just want to take pretty pictures. I don't want to send a message to anybody. I just want to take my pictures and be done with it and have a business. But the fact is that whether you want to take pretty pictures or you want to write a nice book or whatever you're aiming to do, the fact is that you're sending a message, whether you're intentionally doing it or not. There's going to be a message embedded in what you put out there into the world. So it's best to know what that message is so that you can not only hone in on it and refine it and make it as accessible as possible, but also because that message is going to be what sets you apart and what launches your business into any sort of success. So I think know your message and get behind it and really understand how to brand it. And once you start thinking deeply about what your message is and how you can best communicate that, then all of a sudden you have a business structure.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's great. So I like to take pretty pictures myself, and I put them on Instagram, and I call it a day. I don't call myself a professional photographer. So that's so I understand, that I think a lot of artists have that difference, or having that problem of separating, like, this is what I really want to do with this is what the business side of it actually wants. Because there's a lot of people who take really pretty pictures and they put them up on Instagram, but they don't make a business out of it. That's just what they do.
And you don't have to. That's the thing. Like, just because you take pretty pictures doesn't mean it has to be a business. But if you want it to be, well, then you better know why you're taking those pretty pictures.
Exactly. I'm curious